Gabriel is the author of a very large number of very important papers, as well as the author of 2 books, The Hidden Wealth of Nations and The Triumph of Injustice. Gabriel's research focuses on the accumulation, distribution, and taxation of global wealth, and has been a major catalyst towards re-energizing the analysis of the macroeconomic and distributional implications of globalization. He has received the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economics Association in 2023. He was elected Fellow of the Econometric Society in 2024 and awarded the Bernasser Prize and the Sloan Research Fellowship in 2019, amongst other distinctions. Gabriel, we are absolutely delighted to have you with us today. The title of Gabriel's talk today is The Billionaire Tax, a Modest Proposal for the 21st Century. Progressive taxation is a key pillar of democratic societies, but thanks to new research, including Gabriel's, there is now clear evidence that contemporary tax systems, instead of being progressive, are failing to effectively tax the very wealthiest individuals in our societies. In fact, research shows that lower income citizens are taxed much more heavily. Gabriel will be detailing a proposal for a coordinated minimum tax, ensuring that dollar billionaires pay at least 2% of their wealth in taxes each year. He will discuss the feasibility of such a new form of international coordination and the potential obstacles, I can think of many this week, to such a measure. Gabriel's proposal has earned wide coverage, especially via his work with Brazil in the context of the G20. What has been dubbed La Taxe Zucman has even been voted through in the lower chamber of the French National Assembly 2 weeks ago. Gabriel's lecture will be followed by comments from Stefan Durkin, who is Professor of Development Economics at the Blavatnik School of Government and the Economics Department, as well as co-director of the Oxford Martin Program on African Governance. Gabriel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Such a pleasure to have the chance to have this discussion with you. And so the starting point, as Ricardo said, is indeed that progressive taxation is a key pillar of modern democratic societies. And that's due to a number of reasons. Number one, a progressive tax system is key to ensure social cohesion and trust in government. It's very difficult to trust governments that structurally take more money from the poor than from the rich. And we know from a large body of work in economics, in the social sciences, that social trust in government is an important driver of economic growth and development. Number two, of course, a progressive tax system is essential to generate the money, the tax revenues that are needed to fund education, healthcare, infrastructure, the key engines in the long run of economic growth. That's in fact, indeed, perhaps the main lesson from economic history. If you look at why countries are rich, how today's wealthy nations have become wealthy, it's not by undertaxing the truly super wealthy to encourage innovation or things like that. It's through massive public investment in high quality education for all, in high quality healthcare, and in high quality public infrastructure. That's what makes people and businesses productive. And number three, a progressive tax system is essential to regulate inequality, and in particular to keep wealth concentration in check. So wealth, to be clear, wealth for most of the population, it's a good thing. Wealth is safety for your old days, it's safety if you lose a job. But wealth for the truly super rich, the reason why they accumulate wealth is not for retirement, right? Wealth for the super rich is power. And an excessive concentration of wealth, it has long been understood, that an excessive concentration of wealth means an excessive concentration of power. The power to influence policies, the power to influence government, the power to influence the prevailing ideology by buying newspapers and so on and so on. And so it has also been long understood, and in this country, the UK, there was a very progressive tax system after World War II. In the US also for several decades in the middle of the 20th century, that a very progressive tax system can curb the concentration of wealth and contribute to protecting a democracy. Now, the problem that we have is that now there's a growing body of evidence that shows very clearly indeed that all taxes included, the super rich pay much less tax relative to their income than the rest of the population. So the chart here tries to summarize this body of work, and that's new. These are studies that have been conducted mostly in partnership with tax administrations in different countries over the last 3-4 years. And what they all try to do is to follow the same method and the same principles to allocate all taxes collected by governments, whether it's the individual income tax or the VAT, sales taxes, corporate taxes that are allocated to the owners of corporations, everything, and then to compute what each group of the population pays in tax relative to their income. Okay, so on the x-axis, you have the different income groups. P010 is the 10% of people, of adults with the lowest income. P1020 is the next 10%, with a zoom on the right, on the super rich, all the way up to dollar billionaires. And on the y-axis, you have the effective tax rate, taking into account all taxes at all levels of government. And in all these countries, and there's ongoing work, in Brazil, in Scandinavian countries, in many countries throughout the world, and you see the same pattern. In all countries, the super rich pay less tax. In a country like France, half as much tax as all other social groups, as the working class, as the middle class. A situation where, to summarize, billionaires pay much less tax than their secretaries. So where is that coming from? This is coming from the failure of the individual income tax to tax the super rich. So the progressive income tax is one of the most important revolutions of the fiscal history of countries and over the last centuries, but it's an imperfect and incomplete revolution. So the progressive income tax was created in many countries in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but it has never really managed at taxing the truly super rich. For one simple reason, which is that when you're extremely wealthy, it's relatively simple. It's too simple to structure your wealth such that this wealth will not generate a sizable amount of income. And you can do that by avoiding dividend distributions and avoiding realizing capital gains. The wealth of the rich, it's mostly, corresponds mostly to the ownership of stakes in companies. So it's essentially shares of businesses that they own or control, and so they can just say, okay, just don't distribute any dividends, and they can just decide not to sell shares. They can also use holding companies or similar structures like trusts in some countries to avoid paying the income tax. And look, for a long time, people suspected that this was happening, and you had case studies and you had revelations. So for instance, a few years ago, you had revelations by the US media, ProPublica, on the tax payments of US billionaires. And you saw in some years, people like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk paying zero or almost zero income tax. In 1 year, Bezos, CEO of Amazon, he didn't pay, as CEO of Amazon, he didn't pay himself any wage. Amazon was not distributing dividends. He didn't sell shares, and so his taxable income was zero. And he said, oh, look, I'm so poor that I'm going to claim family benefits. And he receives family benefits. That's the way the tax code works. So the richest man, or one of the richest men in the world, reporting essentially zero income and receiving benefits that are supposed to be reserved for, working class or middle class taxpayers. So we knew that this, at least in some cases, was a reality. But what's new with those studies is that they established clearly that this failure of the income tax is a structural problem. So here is the same graph as the first chart that I showed, but just focusing on just one tax, which is the individual income tax. So in principle, the pillar of tax progressivity, but as you can see on the chart, yes, indeed, you know, for most of the population, for most of the distribution, the income tax is progressive in the sense that the effective tax rate rises with income, but only up to a point, and past a certain point, the effective tax rate collapses to essentially nearly 0% in EU countries, and a bit more than 0% in the US, because in particular the US has some anti-abuse provisions, some anti-tax avoidance provisions regarding the use of holding companies that other countries don't have. But despite those anti-avoidance rules, still very low levels of taxation of income for US billionaires. Now, what's the consequence and why do we care about that? So we care because, of course, if people who already have a lot of wealth can accumulate more wealth tax-free, this has a snowballing effect on the concentration of wealth. And so I think this has been not the only, but one important reason behind the dramatic rise in billionaire wealth at the global level. And that's what the chart here shows. The chart uses data from Forbes magazine that tracks global billionaires back to the mid-1980s and plots the share of wealth owned by the top plots the total wealth of the top 0.0001% wealthiest people in the world, so roughly 2,900 households today, which corresponds to the number of dollar billionaires today. So you consider that fixed fraction of the world population, you compute using the Forbes data their total wealth, and you divide that by world GDP. And so what the chart shows is that, you know, billionaires, in short, owned in wealth the equivalent of 3–4% of world GDP in the 1980s, early 1990s, and today they own the equivalent of 14% of world GDP in wealth. And to put it more concretely, what this means is that their wealth has been growing on average at a rate of 7.1% a year net of inflation over those, you know, almost 4 decades, when average income per adult at the global level has been growing 1.3% a year, and average wealth per adult 3.2% per year. Okay, so that's the dramatic rise in billionaire wealth, in part mechanically due to the fact that, okay, if I get very high returns on my wealth because I own businesses, multinationals that are very profitable, and I have no tax to pay, I know this is just going to accumulate faster than for other people who, before they can save any money, have to pay, income tax on payroll taxes and so on. Okay, another illustration of what's happening with wealth concentration here in the case of the US. Okay, so now let's focus on an even smaller slice of the population. Previous chart was the top 0.0001% globally. Here it's 0.00001% richest Americans. So it's about it's exactly 19 households today, so 19 wealthiest people in the US. It was 4 households in 1913, Andrew Carnegie and his peers. And so you can compute their wealth, again using Forbes magazine data. The first Forbes ranking was for 1913. There was a study by Fortune magazine in 1957, and then the annual Forbes 400 list since 1982. You can compute their wealth and you can divide that by total US wealth. So what's the share of total wealth in the US owned by the mega billionaires, okay? So at the time of Andrew Carnegie, about 0.9% of total wealth belonged to that tiny elite. Then, it went down to almost, 0%, 0.1%, in the early 1980s, in the 70s, in the 60s, just the truly super wealthy own much less wealth relative to the size of the US economy than in the past, and of course than today, where the last dot is especially striking. The last dot is for the end of 2024. So you can see that since 1982, the series is somewhat volatile. So for instance, during the stock market boom of the late 1990s, the dot-com bubble, the wealth of billionaires grows fast. Okay, during COVID, there's another spike. And then there was a third and the biggest spike of them all in 2024 that really happened right at the time of the US presidential election, or in fact just a few weeks, that started just a few weeks before the presidential election, where it was becoming clearer and clearer that Trump had a very high chance to win. And when this got capitalized into the price of companies like Tesla, for instance, you could see that this spike here as a kind of capitalization of oligarchic capture in the US. Perhaps the clearest illustration that you could think of how extreme wealth really is extreme power. Okay, so what do we do? What do we do to address this? Last year, I had the privilege to work with the Brazilian government as president of the G20 to kind of develop a proposal for a coordinated minimum tax on the super rich. And so the idea is to say, well, okay, dollar billionaires should pay in tax a minimum that should be expressed not as a fraction of their income, because their income is fuzzy, is not well defined, but as a fraction of their wealth. That's how it's going to work. A minimum tax is a powerful tool because it addresses all possible forms of tax avoidance, no matter where they're coming from. Basically, what it says is that if you're very rich, at the end of the day, you have to pay in tax at least 2% of your wealth. Very few taxpayers will be affected. We've seen that there are about $3,000 billionaires today, and yet it would generate a lot of tax revenue, about $200 to $250 billion annually. So, I presented the proposal in a meeting of G20 finance ministers just 1 year ago in Sao Paulo. Brazil commissioned this report, a blueprint for a coordinated minimum tax, blah, 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 blah. Very long title that I handed in June. And so now this idea is being discussed internationally, which I really want to praise the leadership of the Brazilian government here. The G20 has existed since 1999. The G7 since 1975, and not once in all those years, and those finance ministers, they meet all the time, very regularly during the year, not once had those issues been put on the agenda of these meetings, how to tax the rich, fighting inequality, tax progressivity. These are some of the most important questions of our time. It was the first time 1 year ago that in one of these forums, these issues were being discussed. What difference would such a minimum tax make? A modest difference. To be clear, it would not make our tax systems progressive. Okay, and so that's why I picked that rate of 2%, because it's a rate that should be consensual in the sense that we all have different ideas about how progressive the tax system should be, and it's a very legitimate debate, and in fact a central debate in democratic societies. But I think nobody, or almost nobody, condones the notion that billionaires should be allowed to pay less than other social groups. And so with a 2% minimum tax, basically you get rid of that anomaly. So I think it's an idea that my thought was, okay, I think all countries and everybody should be able to come in favor of this kind of really minimum implementation of our basic fairness principles around taxation. If you extend the tax to people who have more than $100 million, as I showed in the report, then you can really ensure that you have not a regressive tax system. You have a flat, you would have a tax system that resembles a flat tax. And then it's up for other countries to be more ambitious if they want to have a progressive tax system. Okay, so that's what it would do. Now let's talk about what's really important, okay? Because international coordination, having an agreement at the G20, it all sounds very 2024. And what about March 2025? So the main implementation challenge, to be clear, is that we're not going to have an agreement in the short term by all G20 countries, let alone countries outside of the G20. But what's very important to understand, what's essential, is that a global participation is not necessary, and that a minimum tax like that can be implemented by any country or any coalition of countries, kind of coalition of the willing, and that it could work really well, even if only one country does that. To make it work, what you need is to have strong guardrails against tax competition. Okay, and here's exactly what you need to have. You need to have two things. You need to have, number one, rules that are going to ensure that if your billionaires move to another country that doesn't implement that tax, they will still have to pay the tax. Okay, and you can do that. Some countries already have provisions like that. So for instance, a couple of weeks ago, the French National Assembly, as Ricardo mentioned, passed a version of this, minimum tax of 2% for French taxpayers with more than 100 million euros in net wealth. And there's a provision in the law that says, it's not yet a law, but in what was passed by the French National Assembly, that says that people who would move out of France would still have to pay the tax for 5 years after they move. You could, be more ambitious. You could say, 10 years, 15 years. Maybe it could depend on the number of years that you've been a tax resident in France. So if you've spent 70 years in France and you've become a billionaire there, that's of course because, at least in part, you've benefited from education and infrastructure and so on. And so it's perfectly natural and logical for France to keep taxing you after you move if you are not taxed in your new country of residency. So we could, any country, the UK, if the UK was to implement a tax like that, could say, okay, that's what we're going to do. If our rich people move to a low tax country, we'll keep taxing them for some years. And the other ingredient you need some extraterritorial taxation of non-resident billionaires. And that's where it gets really important and really interesting. So let me take a little bit of time to talk about this. So extraterritorial taxation of billionaires, first of all, is justified. What does it mean very concretely? It means like, if France or the UK was to implement that policy alone, they should also tax US billionaires and Chinese billionaires and the billionaires of non-participating countries. It's justified, number one, because, of course, the wealth of global billionaires is a global creation. Their wealth essentially comes from owning stakes in multinational companies that have access to world markets, that emit carbon, that contributes to global climate change. Not even mentioning the fact that they all benefit from knowledge that was accumulated by throughout millennia by humanity. So it's a global creation, and so it's perfectly legitimate to ensure that they pay some tax somewhere. And so if they are not taxed in their country of residency, it is for the other countries to make sure that they pay some minimum amount of tax. Now, second, how could this work in practice? Well, there's a lot of text for an idea that is not terribly complicated, although it's a novel idea, and so it deserves a little bit of explaining. So the idea here is that any country on its own can condition market access to foreign multinationals and their billionaire owners paying a minimum amount of tax. So for instance, let's take a very concrete example. The UK could say, look, if Tesla wants to sell cars in the UK, then Musk, the main shareholder of Tesla, should have to pay a minimum amount of tax. And if he doesn't pay tax in the US, which he does not, then the UK, as being in effect some of the source of Musk's wealth, should collect some of the taxes that the US declines to collect. What fraction exactly sales that are made in the UK? So if Tesla makes 10% of its global sales in the UK, you could say, well, in effect, 10% of Musk's wealth originates from the UK, and so the UK is going to collect 10% of the minimum tax that Musk should pay, 10% of the 2%. It's not a lot, but if you're one country alone, you cannot kind of collect a ton, because then Tesla would just say, okay, we're leaving the market. It's not worth it anymore to sell in the UK. But the more countries you have in the coalition, if it's the UK plus the European Union plus Brazil and so on, very quickly you can reach a critical mass where a sizable amount of the minimum tax would be collected by that coalition of the willing. So this approach, in effect, is what you could call tariffs for billionaires. Okay, so in exchange of market access, you have to pay some tax if you are not taxed in your home country. And that sounds like, okay, is that some crazy ivory tower idea? Not at all, because as I'm sure many of you know, there is already a minimum tax, a coordinated minimum tax for multinational companies. That was agreed on by more than 130 countries in 2021. That's implemented by the UK, by the European Union, by many other countries. And in that international agreement, there is a set of provisions that do essentially this, that say, well, the multinationals of non-participating countries will face extra taxes if they are not taxed in their home country. They will face extra taxes in the UK, in the European Union, and so on. And so what I'm saying is that we should just extend that logic that already exists for multinationals, and we should apply it to wealthy individuals as well. And so the conclusion is that the minimum tax expressed as a fraction of wealth, not income, is the most powerful tool to ensure that the very rich do not pay less than the rest of the population. And it's also a very powerful tool that democracies can mobilize against, what we have to call, by its name, global oligarchy. And so you can do that in two ways. In the short term, I think what would be a very powerful response to the tariff threats that are agitated and already implemented in some cases by the Trump administration is to retaliate like that with tariffs for oligarchs. So essentially, okay, you're taxing the goods that enter the US, and what we're going to do is that we are going to tax your under-taxed multinationals and their under-taxed owners. Again, taking the case of Tesla and Musk, if they want to keep having access to our markets, they will have to pay extra taxes. This kind of focused and targeted retaliation, in my view, could be pretty powerful. And it could be powerful because, let's forget for a second about Trump and think more about the long term. It's powerful because it could start a virtuous cycle, in contrast to trade wars that are eventually destructive for most of the population. In that instance, this kind of tariffs for billionaires has very different properties in the long term, in the sense that what it would do is that it would encourage eventually countries like the US or tax havens or low tax countries in general to collect the taxes themselves rather than letting the destination market countries collect it on their behalf. And so it could start a kind of process of a race to the top where those countries would be encouraged at some point to tax their own billionaires, to tax their own multinationals, to collect the revenues themselves. And so you would see the race to the bottom with corporate taxation or with the taxation of the rich being replaced by a race to the top. So that's my conclusion, that by using targeted extraterritorial measures like that, it's possible for democracies to export minimal standards of justice and sustainability. Thank you very much.
Gabriel, thank you very much. And I was asked to make a few comments, and I was reminded by hearing your proposal and hearing first about it all, I was reminded of something some years back, maybe a bit less than a decade. I was, I think, at an event paid for by one of these foundations that was set up by one of the robber barons of the late 19th century, who at the time ruthlessly exploited all the rules of the game and whatever. And then, Rockefeller is funding a lot of charitable activities now. But anyway, it was a very interesting event organized by Rockefeller. And we had a session. It was all about digital economy and digital technologies. And there were several of these billionaires who were actually there. And Eric Schmidt, ex-Google,
had a bit of an open thing, and he was willing to do a bit like a fireside chat, so we could ask him any questions. And there were a few of us on the back row that then decided to ask him, say, look, shouldn't we regulate these tech companies? Isn't that all just excessive monopoly powers and it's the whole kind of thing? And I will never forget that he turned to me when I had asked a question like that, and he said, I can hear you're European. You do not understand America. You don't understand why we have all these systems and how wealth is being created. Now, so I wonder whether he would tell you that the same thing, that you sound quite European. But anyway, let's come back to that. There is an important thing here to think a little bit about, why would you do this and maybe not something else, okay? And I think what matters here is to think carefully about why would we do this? It could be because, as you also introduced, it appears they are either evading or at least avoiding, okay? And the taxes are not being paid, and this sounds like clearly something is going on. Or put it slightly differently, a tax code that has all kinds of favorable treatment for capital is somehow finding ways that they can get all kinds of constructions. Now, you may want to ask yourself, then, is that tax code designed? Well, the reason why we have these things, whether I like it or not, is arguably because there were at some point people, not just because they were powerful, but also thinking we should find ways of encouraging productive investment. We should find ways of actually, encouraging that things get invested in companies, in equity, in risk, to actually make progress. Now, then you have to ask yourself, well, is the proposal that Gabriel offers us, is that the best way to overcome some of the failings of the tax code, to properly maybe distinguish between, really sensible investment in productive and new things that need to be invested in, or is it just hoarding and getting constructions that we're doing it? A second thing you could say, well, but it's fundamentally a problem of fairness. Even if they do this, and even though, even if we were to fix the tax code to actually making a better distinction between capital that's put into companies really to generally accumulate and not in the Bezos style and whatever, to just avoiding paying taxes and putting it all there and indeed some getting benefit payments and whatever, is basically we say, look, there has to be a limit to this. They're so wealthy that surely these constructions we do find unfair. It reminds me a bit of, the traditional efficiency equity trade-off, and say, well, look, we should be willing to say at some point that equity has an equal status than purely seen from efficiency. But you want to go further, and I think some of these ideas touch probably on a third thing, which is where you started with, that these people, 200, 300, 400, have these kind of powers that, as we seem to be observing in the last few weeks, have extraordinary power because of their wealth, and create huge externalities for everybody and for the world, basically, and for all society. So that actually their power wants to be addressed. And somehow or another, we think, that has to be the reason why they need to be in some system of doing it. So I'm reminded there of a recent book by a political philosopher in Amsterdam, Ingrid Robins, who wrote a nice penguin pocket on limitarianism. There is a good case to actually limit at some point, and making the case to some kind of limit. And I'm very glad that my lectures in economics pay off for her, because she was my student. But anyway, but it's a nice idea to actually begin to do it. Now, I think one of the reasons why you want to go for something like Gabriel's is that all the things that I say, whether it's about, maybe we should have a much more sophisticated tax code that properly deals with these things, well, this is simple, and this is clear, and this is transparent. At the same time, I do think it's still tricky. These simple rules, and this is implementation, and of course, it's not what I just want to moan about. But of course, these people will find ways and new constructions and new structures to try to get around it, being ahead of the game. But that's an advantage of being simple and neat. It's a bit like behavioral science. If you keep it very simple, then it becomes very transparent when you try to avoid this. And I think that's probably the strongest argument, I would say, why you go for the simple one here. Because if you do some of these more complicated ones I was alluding to, targeting the right billionaire that really disrupts and not the billionaire that is nice, or indeed the nice billionaire that actually invests in risk capital and really pushes the world forward, not the one that is not nice, you want to actually keep it simple and so on doing it. And you know, and if we then get a criticism from America that it sounds quite European, I don't care. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Gabriel. Gabriel, would you like to respond?
Yes, very
Yeah,
quick.
please.
So, and this Eric Schmidt thing that this all sounds, or this would all sound very European. Nothing could be farther from the truth, and it's very striking. You know, there is a kind of collective amnesia in the U.S. about the own fiscal history of the U.S. The U.S. had between 1930 and 1980, so 50 years, a top marginal income tax rate that was on average 78% over those 50 years. And for several years, you know, during World War II, and then in the 50s, and still during the Eisenhower administration, a Republican, top marginal income tax rate that was around, you know, 94%. There's a famous speech by Franklin Roosevelt in Congress in 1942 where he goes to Congress and he says, look, I think that nobody should have an income after paying taxes of more than $20,000 of the time, which would be the equivalent of perhaps 1 to 2 million pounds today. Therefore, I propose to create a new tax rate of 100% on all income, on everything, including income that was tax exempt, like for tax exempt bonds, everything above $20,000. And so the members of Congress are like, 100%, you know, yeah, maybe that's quite a lot, but you know, they still agree on 94%. You know, it's not very far from 100%. And that was the policy of the US for quite some time. There was a consensus on that because, as I said, this was these confiscatory top marginal income tax rates were created by Roosevelt, but were kept, and there was a very strong consensus still in the 50s by Eisenhower. And it did make a big difference. You know, it did play a very important role in the decline in income and wealth concentration that I showed in one of my charts. Because, of course, if above several million dollars, you know, you're taxed at almost 100%, what's the point, you know, of trying to earn several millions? So the point of this top tax rate, it was not to create, to generate tax revenues. It was really to regulate inequality. You know, that's just you talked about limitarianism. That was exactly that. It was about creating a maximum legal income. And there's one other country that followed that policy. That's the UK, that also had top marginal income tax rates really very, very high. But there's no continental European country that ever did that. So it is a specifically US and British fiscal tradition. So, you know, that whole thing on it's a European thing is just really off.
Gabriel, let me ask a question which goes straight to this, and it has to do with the changes in the US over the last 2 weeks. So if I understand things correctly, the Biden administration was not for a global wealth tax, but there were aspects of the way they were thinking about the domestic taxation of billionaires which seem to converge with some of your assumptions. Over the last 2 weeks, that's changed radically. We've seen America leaving the global minimum tax in January, the stopping of the enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This shows not only a desertion from anything like a shared agenda, but we risk having America being a very truculent force enforcing things the other way. We've seen the introduction of the golden visas to attract that oligarchic money that you refer to into the US domestic economy. Delaware, South Dakota, Nevada were already doing that to some extent, but this is going to be more so. So the question is, these massive changes in the US, what do they mean, not just for your specific policy, but for the international mindset of cooperation that seems to be underpinning it?
So, let's start with the specific policy. For the specific policy, they don't matter a lot, because nobody thought that this type of coordinated minimum tax on the super rich could be created in a matter of months or even a couple of years. As I said, there's a minimum tax of 15%, very weak, but at least more than zero on multinational companies. The discussions at the G20 started in 2015. The agreement happened in 2021. The implementation started in 2024. So at least 6 years to get to an agreement, almost 10 years to get to the beginning of an implementation. So I think that's the time frame that everybody was, myself included, considering last year. And Trump, unless of course he becomes a dictator, but he's not going to be here forever. And so, of course, he's not accelerating the process, but it was going to take some time, no matter whether it was Trump or someone else in the White House. So the timing is not fundamentally changed. We are in a stage where the proposal is on the table. It's a new idea. As I said, it was not discussed in those forums until last year, and so now there's a discussion in ministries of finance in many countries to study the problem, to understand the value added of having some international coordination on the issue. And look, I think this will happen. It's going to take 5-10 years. I hope, of course, it would be better if it was 2 or 3 years, but it will take some time. And Trump is not changing that, fortunately. Now, for the broader spirit of cooperation, and that's what I tried to explain towards the end of my remarks, I think there is an emergency for putting in place countermeasures against his very destructive and unfounded policies, especially very high tariffs across the board for Mexico, for Canada, soon for the European Union. And that's where I think the most powerful way to counter that is to say, look, if you do this, we will retaliate by having what I think should be called tariffs for oligarchs, meaning your multinational firms. Trump wants to, not only the US is not implementing the minimum tax of 15% on multinationals, but he wants to arm twist other countries so that they also don't implement it.
Exactly.
And don't overtax the US multinationals as is planned to happen.
Yeah.
And so I think what's going to be really important, like this year, in the coming weeks, is for those countries to say, not only are we holding our ground and standing up, and we are going to implement the agreement and tax US multinationals if you don't tax them, but we'll go beyond that. We are going to extend that logic, that extraterritorial logic to US billionaires. So I think, yes, we are in that situation today where we have to go through this with, it's a very non-cooperative type of international economic relation, but with an ultimate goal of cooperation. That's what's really important, and that's what makes it fundamentally different than trade wars and tariffs, which are essentially lose-lose. Here, the ultimate the ultimate goal of all of this is to, in fact, encourage all countries, including the US, but all countries, to tax their companies and to tax their wealthy people. And if they don't do that, then other countries will do that on their behalf. But it provides incentives for all countries to converge towards some harmonization to minimum tax rates on the rich and on multinationals. So that I think is very important.
Let me ask you a question. You alluded to the matter of extraterritoriality, both in your comments and during your presentation. traditionally, when tax proposals are made, there's the concern that if wealth taxes are increased, the rich are just going to go elsewhere. And under a decade ago, France tried to introduce something like a wealth tax, and wealthy people relocated to Morocco, to Belgium, to Switzerland, and they weren't really captured by that. But in your work, both The Hidden Wealth of Nations and in a number of papers, you're particularly sensitized to the role of jurisdictions like Dubai and Singapore as new locations for the wealthy to migrate to. Do you think those new jurisdictions that are benefiting so much from the relocations of high net worth individuals would reciprocate or in any way feel themselves beholden to that? Domestically, in places like France or Brazil or other taxing economies, we know the rich can find ways around this sort of time lag that you want to hold them to. But the key point that I'm asking about here is that there will be new jurisdictions, perhaps the United States is one of them as well, that will positively welcome these billionaires and positively giving them secure guarantees that they will not be messed with if they take protection under these jurisdictions. How would one address that?
So, in two ways. Number one, I think you don't want to exaggerate the international mobility of very wealthy people in response to taxation. It exists, it is something that has to be taken seriously, and the best way to take it seriously is to look at the academic studies that have been conducted on that issue, and there are a number of very high quality studies using administrative data, in particular in Scandinavian countries, that have had wealth taxes, and when you can track the entire population over a very long period of time. And all the studies at the highest scientific level obtain the same conclusion, which is that this mobility is not zero, but the magnitudes are just not very big.
Okay.
They're just not very big. So that's one thing. But it's not the most important thing to understand, because you could still imagine that, as you alluded to, maybe in the future, okay, if the US becomes a kind of big tax haven for billionaires, maybe these elasticities, like economists say, they're going to increase, and so okay. So the most important thing to understand is that tax competition is not a law of nature, and that there are unilateral policies that countries can implement on their own to curb it. And so I've tried to give one example in my quick presentation, which was about saying we are going to keep our keep taxing our ex-residents, after they leave. So let me try to elaborate a bit more on that, just so everybody understands, because it is actually very important. At the moment, the way that countries tax, people who move abroad, you have two models. You have the US is one model where in the US taxation is based on citizenship. So if you were born in the US, let's say you have US citizenship, and then your parents move when you are 2 months old, in principle you have to pay taxes in the US until you die, even if you never come again in the US. That's one model. What the other countries are doing, essentially all other countries are doing the opposite extreme. Opposite extreme in the sense that they say, well, if you've lived all your life in France, let's say, or in the UK, and now you move to Switzerland, then immediately we stop taxing you. Mm-hmm. Both of these models are too extreme and they're bad. The best, the good, the right model is an in-between where taxes should follow you under three conditions. One, if you've lived in a country for a long time. I don't think citizenship should have anything to do with that. It should be whether you've been a long-term tax resident in a country. Second, if you've become very rich in that country, we can define, 10, 100 million, whatever, very rich. And three, now you move to a country that's going to tax you less than the country where you built your wealth, then the country where you built your wealth, your original country, should keep taxing you for some years. Perhaps not until you die, perhaps this can decrease progressively over time, but it should keep taxing you for a number of years. And the rationale here is very clear. Wealth is always, at least partly, a social creation, and so there is just no natural right to become a billionaire and then say, that's it, I don't have any tax to pay anywhere. If your new country declines to tax you, other countries have to say, no, no, look, you have tax duties to, you know, humanity. You should pay tax in your new country. If they don't make you pay, we will make you pay. And so this is really important because it shows that the choice is ours. You know, so the US or Switzerland, whatever, they can choose whatever policy they want. They can try to attract oligarchs. They can offer tax breaks. But it's our choice to undermine their choice. Okay? And we can do that ourselves.
Gabriel, before we open the floor to questions from the audience, I have a very brief question having to do with your work with the G20. There was at the heart of this effort a like-minded partnership between, you know, the finance ministers of Brazil and France, who were quite supportive, very supportive of your efforts, and around the initiative, I won't say a counterintuitive alliance, but certainly an alliance that transcends north-south boundaries. And the sort of conversations I saw, for instance, last week, the Spanish foreign minister made positive remarks about your proposal. Tell us just a little bit about what it was to put together this sort of unexpected alliance, and how productive going forward, and with all the obstacles that we outlined today, there are plenty, but how do you see the lessons of that coalition building?
I think that I was very, you know, happy and honored to be to have the chance to be involved in that, because I think it is an example for, you know, it provides a path towards a future for multilateralism. So I think the future, you know, the future of multilateralism is going to be essentially like that, you know, coalition of countries from, you know, global south and from the north, and, you know, it was Brazil last year, and tomorrow or in a few years with a different government could be India, you know, it could be South Africa, which has been very, you know, supportive also of that process last year, coming together to do something very simple, which is to completely rewrite the rules of globalization, to put issues of equality, planetary, you know, habitability, sustainability at the center of international economic agreements. You know, it's the big failure of globalization as we've known it since the 1980s is that we've had all sorts of trade and, you know, free capital flow agreements that were completely silent about taxation, about inequality, about, you know, carbon and so on. And with what's starting next year, I think, is the beginning, the very, very beginning of an alternative to that, because of course there are very many different ways to organize globalization, and I think that way, you know, these coalition of countries across the south and the north, putting issues of tax justice and equality at the center of international agreements, that's the way forward.
Thank you, Gabriel. And on that note, I'm going to open the floor to questions. If you could raise your arm, and please, when you speak, introduce yourself briefly and keep your question short, because we have, or your comment, because we have lots of expertise and lots of interesting people in the room. Over here.
Great, thank you very much. My name's Jason Sharman from the University of Cambridge. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just had a quick question about the presentation of the problem and then of the solution. If I understood rightly, the problem is one of legal tax avoidance, not illegal tax evasion. At least it was presented. There was no mention of tax havens as well, which was interesting given your previous work. So that's just a clarificatory one. The problem is legal tax avoidance, not evasion, and not tax havens. The second one is to do with the solution. The problem is presented by you. You don't actually want to tax billionaires. You just want to make them leave your country. If billionaires leave your country, your income and wealth distribution will get much better. Threats to democracy will be removed. And you don't lose any tax because they weren't paying any tax anyway.
That's that last statement is correct. Yes.
Thanks.
Jason, I haven't quite thought a bit like that.
That's great. That's spot on. Actually, I made that computation for France. starting with the last comment, that if you take all, the French billionaires, about 100 of them, and tomorrow they all move to the Cayman Islands, what difference will it make? To their tax payments, almost zero, because they pay almost zero today. To the tax revenues of France, same, by definition, almost zero, or to be precise, 0.03% of GDP in lost tax revenues. So that is true. Now, back to the original question. So the problem, is it a tax avoidance or a tax evasion problem? It's in between, okay? Because here's the thing. The key reason why they have such low tax rates today is because they use, family holding companies as intermediaries to earn their income, okay? So essentially, their income is dividend income, but instead of earning the dividends directly subject to dividend income tax, they put a kind of intermediate company, which is pretty much a bit like a shell company, in between. So the income is paid to the holding company, and that dividend is tax-free, and as long as it remains in the holding and then is reinvested to do all sorts of things, it's tax-free. Now you might say, well, that's all perfectly legal, so what's the problem? Well, nah, not so fast, because in the tax law of most countries, you have a set of provisions that are known as the economic substance doctrine or general anti-abuse provisions in the European Union that basically say that transactions that are conducted with the sole, or sometimes it's written with the main purpose of avoiding taxes, transactions and structures that are created with are illegal. And what's the main purpose, or even the sole purpose of all these holding companies? It's clear that the main purpose, I think, is really to avoid taxes. And so it's really in a gray zone between stuff that's not like outright fraud, like having a bank account abroad and failing to report income, but that's really not clearly legal either. It's a kind of in a gray zone of, I think there's a pretty strong case to be made to be clear that this is not legal, but there's been a choice to not enforce those economic substance provisions as much as they could be. So that's the answer.
There's a question here.
Do you mind if I don't stand up? I'm Ian Busby. I'm the chair of the Oxford Community Foundation, of which there are hundreds around the world. We focus on raising money from high net worth individuals and billionaires and distributing it on a location-based basis to those who need it most through charities. So we think very hard about what makes billionaires part company with their wealth. And what's interesting for me is if I took the numbers you're suggesting and I divide them by population, the value of your tax proposals to Oxfordshire is £25 million a year, and Oxfordshire receives £5 billion a year in public money for all kinds of things. So your tax proposal is a drop in the ocean here. But what also interests me is the way in which the really wealthy give their money. And you'll have come across the Giving Pledge, where 10% of billionaires have publicly declared, including Elon Musk, Larry Ellison, and so on, they're going to give all their wealth away before or by the time they die to the public good. That's 10% of all billionaires. So the thing for me is that billionaires are not all bad people. The risk is that there's a sense they are all bad people and they're not. But clearly there's more than one mechanism available to get money out of these individuals.
Great.
So we take that as a comment.
Yeah, great question. So
Okay.
first, it's really not about billionaires being good people or bad people. Many of them are very good people, or some of them might be bad people, but just like regular people. It's not at all about people. It's about money, and it's about democracy. And philanthropy is great, but it's also, a serious backsliding. I don't know how, what's the proper word, but it's relative. It's a kind of a return to a Victorian era way of organizing society. Just saying, okay, we're going to let very wealthy people decide how they use their money, when we've made progress since the 19th century, and we have had the rise of the fiscal state. We pull together 30, 40, 50% of our income through a tax system to decide collectively, transparently, democratically about whether the money should go to education or health or infrastructure or other things, and to say, well, all of that, let's forget about it and return to just rich people deciding how they spend their money. I think from the perspective of the development of democracy would be a setback. But on your first question, I very much agree that it's not a lot of money. That's why I say it's a modest proposal. The 2% minimum tax on billionaires. It's very modest in different ways. It's modest relative to the rate of growth of wealth for billionaires, the rate of return on their wealth, which has been more like 7% a year net of inflation. So 2% versus 7%. To be very clear, if this minimum tax was in place, it would not reduce wealth concentration. It would not even stabilize global wealth inequality. It would just reduce the pace of the increase, everything else equal, of wealth inequality. So it's very modest and limited in that sense. And just for the revenues, well, 200 to $250 billion in revenue globally is not completely negligible. The best studies that we have estimate that to deal with the challenges of climate change, developing countries need an additional $500 billion in public revenues each year. So you can get about half of that with that minimum tax on global billionaires. So from that perspective, it's not going to fix all the world's problems, but it's not totally insignificant. But it's a floor. I think my point is it's very modest. It's a floor in the sense that I can't see a good argument for having less than 2%. I can see many good arguments, and I would be willing myself to defend much higher rates than 2%. I can see many good arguments, but good arguments for allowing the wealthiest people to pay less than the rest of the population, then with the understanding that 10% of them might eventually give money to charities of their choosing, that is very hard to defend, I think.
Thank you. We're going to take 2 or 3 questions now. Please, again, keep them short so we can have as many. We have about just under 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Very thought-provoking, as always. My name is Iram Picheri. I'm from the Blavatnik School of Government. My question is about, one for clarification and then leading to a thorny issue. So the clarification is about the analogy with the global minimum tax for multinationals. And global minimum tax works because companies want to do business with the countries that agree to the deal. And they're big countries. They're big markets. And there are backstops in the model that allow, countries to say, if you want to do any business with me, then you got to pay the tax. And I think that those backstops, at least conceptually, work. Let's leave aside the Trump threats to it. Now, and you can say for the individuals that are rich, they have shares in these companies. So again, you can think about Elon wants, Tesla to be sold globally, and anywhere a Tesla is sold, we can get back to Elon. Again, subject to some sort of registry that allows us to have visibility of who owns what. But at the end of the day, kind of leaving, I think that comes back to the question about now you want the billionaires to leave the countries that implement this. So if I leave, what is the legal framework that will enforce this tax on me? I leave and I go to wherever, Cayman Islands or so. And again, there are lots of caveats to any of these decisions by the billionaires anyway. But So I decided to leave. How is another country able to enforce the tax? You can say, oh, if you come back, I'm going to put you in jail. Like, so you get into this kind of international criminal, I mean, is it a criminal law question? Is it a, how can we set up a legal framework that would capture this?
Okay.
Gentleman over there.
Hey, my name's Dave. I just wanted to ask, who are the main resistors to this? You said that you could argue for a higher than 2% rate. So who is it? The billionaires? Is it the aspiring class? Is it governments? Who's keeping you down at 2%?
Can you keep these two in mind and bring another one in? Yeah. Sorry, Neil, here.
My name's Neil McCulloch. I'm a director of the policy practice, which works on the political economy reform. And my question is about political feasibility. I was very glad that you mentioned carbon earlier on. Of course, we have a very similar regime about to come into effect, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. The idea being that countries elsewhere will realize that it's better for them to tax their own carbon because otherwise they won't be able to get access to the EU market, and there'll be an equivalent in the UK. But the big danger and the big difficulty with CBAM, as we are all aware, is the political one. When it actually comes in, are the political relationships between the countries that are now going to have to pay this tax really going to enable that tax to be collected? It's very doubtful indeed, because of the difficulty in the diplomatic relationship that will be incurred by imposing such large taxes. Your proposal would seem to be in the same sort of vein, whereby in principle you're forcing everybody else to play ball, but in practice there's much more going on between the UK and the US than simply a billionaire tax.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much. These are three good questions.
Yeah, these are good questions. So on the first question, it's a very good question. I think the main reason why for the type of taxation of ex-residents that I mentioned was not done historically is that there was a feeling that it would be impossible for countries to track the income and the wealth of people after they've moved. But this has changed in 2018 with the creation of the automatic exchange of bank information. So now there is an automatic exchange of bank information between essentially all, the vast majority of countries, more than 100 countries participate, including all the tax havens, including Singapore, Dubai. They are required.
They tick the boxes.
They are, at least on paper, they said yes, we're going to do that. Whether they fully implement it, it's another question. But in terms of principles, it's a huge difference because now they're supposed to send every year all the data they have about the clients of their banks to the respective tax authorities. And so that's what fundamentally, I think, makes this type of tax now possible to enforce in a way it was not possible 5 or 10 years ago. The other thing is that, if billionaires moving to the Cayman Islands, yes, but they can move themselves, but their businesses, they will always have ties to the UK. They own businesses that are not going to become Cayman Islands businesses. The factories, the offices, they remain in populous countries, and so that's fundamentally what makes also the tax enforceable. But the thing I wanted to emphasize is that there is this new information sharing mechanism that I think makes this possible today. On the question that was about who opposes, who's against, look, that it's not very surprising. The billionaires are against. They don't like it. They have a special hatred for it, and for good reasons. If you try to think from their point of view, they have good reason to hate it because it's precisely any kind of tax that's based directly on wealth and not income. They're always very happy to tax consumption because consumption is just a tiny fraction of their income or wealth. They're always very pro-consumption tax. The income tax, they've come to accept it and to live with it because they can avoid it so easily. But anything that's based on wealth, they really hate it because that's the one thing that would work to tax them. So good, and sure, you don't want to underestimate their power to mobilize, against it. But at the same time, you don't want to underestimate the power on the other end, on the other side of the battle, which is that in all countries, you have 70–80% of people supporting this type of tax. You've had opinion polls conducted everywhere, and it's really very, very large majorities of people across party lines, that support these policies. And so, at the end of the day, I'm a big believer in the power of those democratic forces to prevail.
And there was the other question here about the political feasibility.
The question on the political feasibility, I think it depends. It's a good question, and sure, international relation are multidimensional, and so there's tax, but there's many other things. I think it depends a little bit on the tax rates we are talking about. So if we are talking about enforcing a 2% minimum tax standard, or to be more precise, just a fraction of that 2%, it's kind of in an extraterritorial manner, we are not talking about very, very big tax rates. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's politically feasible. We've seen with CBAM, you're absolutely right, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that we're moving in that direction of having border adjustment. If you emit carbon where you produce, but you want to have access to our market, you will have to pay a bit of carbon tax. That's the right logic. I think we have to build on that and just to extend it to not only carbon, but also billionaires, multinational firms. That's the way forward.
We have 3 minutes left, so there's time for another round of questions, just a couple of questions. But those that won't be taken, please keep in mind that we have a drinks reception next door, at least for the fiscal audience here at Oxford. And we'll be able to continue the conversation. Oliver.
Yes, hello, Oliver Below,
And one back there.
journalist. Just wondering whether President Trump is a benefit or a harm to your policy. I can't quite work it out.
And okay, there's the gentleman over there.
Thank you. Ralph Schroeder from Oxford Internet
And
Institute.
one more there, if we can.
I just wonder if you could spell out a little bit the difference between what you propose and the Tobin tax.
Can you speak up, please?
Could you explain the difference with the Tobin tax? Because that would seem also to have some of the obstacles that you have, namely that financial institutions that would be taxed on financial transactions would move, but you could apply the same principle that they would have to pay another 5 years worth.
Yeah, so I've read your G20 report, and I think I was shocked that through the entire report you didn't mention a land value tax even once. Even here, I don't think anyone's really brought up a land value tax. It's one of the most easiest forms of wealth to tax. So given that, it kind of I think most economists agree it kind of avoids a lot of the problems with other taxes that people have brought up. So specifically, why haven't you mentioned the land value tax in your writings, and why do you think what you're proposing is better than a land value tax? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions. You have about a minute and a half to deal with the 3 questions.
Okay, no, that's a great question. Land value tax is frankly not a very good idea, or much less good, I think, than the proposal that I formulate, for the very simple reason that it's a very regressive form of wealth taxation. The very rich, the billionaires, land is going to be really a tiny fraction of their wealth. For the middle class, whose wealth is mostly real estate, land is going to be a big fraction of their wealth. So, I prefer progressive to regressive wealth taxation. Sorry, I'm getting... Tobin tax, is the same. Yes, you have problems of tax competition with the Tobin tax, but it's also not as good because it's an indirect tax on transactions. So who pays the Tobin tax? It's not going to be the wealthiest people. It's going also to be people who have pension funds, middle class individuals who have investments. So, progressive direct taxation is always going to be not only more progressive, but also much more transparent about actually who pays what. And
Oliver Bullow's question: Trump very good or very bad?
Well, very bad.
And on that note, we end a wonderful, very insightful event. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you, Stefan.